FPI's board member, Eric Edelman, and then we'll move into audience Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Congressman Buck McKeon and Eric Edelman.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here this afternoon and to introduce Mr. McKeon. Mr. McKeon was first elected to the Congress in 1992, represents the 25th District in California, and 2 weeks ago was re-elected to his 10th term in the Congress. At the beginning of 2009, after not only his career in the Congress, but a previous successful career in business and municipal government, he became the ranking Republican on the House Armed Services Committee. And it's in that capacity that I've come to know Mr. McKeon and to work with him. It was a great privilege for me to be his designee on the independent QDR panel, co-chaired by former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley and former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, that reported out this past July, and which had its report printed in September. And in working with Mr. McKeon, I know that he has brought to the issues of national defense the same kind of concerns and passion that another great Californian brought to them, and that would be President Ronald Reagan, who I think is a hero that both Mr. McKeon and I share in common. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. McKeon to give a few minutes of remarks. Although the new Congress hasn't organized itself, I think it's a reasonable supposition that he will be the next chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And he will make remarks, and then he and I will have a conversation and open the floor to questions. Mr. McKeon.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Eric. It's the first time I've been compared to Ronald Reagan. But we do share the same state, so that is really good, and I do follow most of what he espoused. I want to thank Eric especially for that introduction and for serving on the independent QDR panel. He did a great job, and he's served in many places many times for his country. Also, thank you to the Foreign Policy Initiative for hosting me this afternoon and giving me the opportunity to share my views on the state of the Department of Defense, our national security policy, and what we can expect from the 112th Congress. This conference deals with leadership, and that's exactly what I'd like to discuss with you here today. Whether it's the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or strengthening our military and investing in a force postured to meet the challenges of the 21st century, or protecting the homeland from adversaries like Al-Qaeda who threaten our way of life, the new Congress will face a number of serious national security challenges. No weapon platform, technological innovation, or even the best fighting force in the world can manage these problems alone. As General Omar Bradley said, leadership is intangible, and therefore no weapon ever designed can replace it. A strong America requires strong American leaders who embody the steely determination and indomitable will of the American people. Let me start with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, beginning with Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, operating from safe havens provided by the repressive Taliban in Afghanistan, planned and launched the attacks on our homeland on September 11th. We must take all necessary steps to ensure that Al-Qaeda does not regain a sanctuary in either Afghanistan or Pakistan. Any withdrawal short of accomplishing this would demonstrate to Al-Qaeda and its affiliated groups that they only have to cause enough casualties or prolong a conflict in order to drive the United States out of regions once deemed vital to our national interest. Such an outcome would gravely threaten the security of America and its allies. We neglected this theater of war far too long. Now that we are finally appropriately focused on Afghanistan, we must succeed. I have full confidence that General Petraeus can achieve the President's objective of disrupting, dismantling, and defeating al-Qaeda and preventing safe havens on both sides of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. But it's essential our Commander-in-Chief give our military the time and the resources it needs to succeed. The July 2011 withdrawal date that accompanied the President's December 9th announcement of the 30,000 surge forces was simply a mistake. In Woodward's book, the President specifically tied the outcome of last year's Afghan policy review to political considerations, telling a visiting senator the reason for the timeliness and arbitrary troop limits was, "I can't lose the whole Democratic Party." Now that we're past the midterm election, I hope the President's calculus will change. We've already seen public reports that the administration is moving away from its July 2011 deadline. With Republicans leading the House, this gives the President the opportunity to focus on victory and not the politics of his caucus. Bipartisan support for pursuing strategic objectives in Afghanistan already exists. While the 2009 Afghanistan strategy was reportedly about how we're going to hand it off and get out of Afghanistan, we now have a new review coming up and a new commander. And I hope the focus from our leaders this time is on winning, not on timetables. During the December review, the American people deserve to hear from the new commander on the ground. We heard General Petraeus report on the surge when he led the forces in Iraq. The Armed Services Committee should hear from General Petraeus on the Afghanistan surge also. Absent hearing from General Petraeus, the next Congress will not be able to effectively evaluate the President's plan to begin the transfer of our forces out of Afghanistan. Victory depends in large part on the will of the American people, and the President has the sole responsibility to rally all the Americans, regardless of domestic political considerations around our troops and their mission. Now turning to Iraq, despite what some on the left say today, the success of the Iraq surge is undeniable, and our troops, along with their families, deserve great credit for their courage and sacrifice. Our military has done all that we have asked them to do in Iraq. General Petraeus and Odierno successfully built a security architecture that allows U.S. forces to ensure Iraqi security there through 2011. The future U.S.-Iraq relationship remains uncertain, however. The U.S. advise and assist force presence expires December 31st next year. Will that continue? Will the U.S. continue to augment Iraq's investment in its security forces? Cutbacks in aid and advisory plans could end any chance of an effective strategic partnership with Iraq and lose the war by default. This is something we cannot accept. As Republican leader, soon-to-be Speaker John Boehner said this past August, the hard truth is that Iraq will continue to remain the target for those who hope to destroy freedom and democracy. The people of that nation and this nation deserve to know what America is prepared to do if the cause for which our troops sacrificed their lives in Iraq is threatened. Our military and civilian personnel in Iraq have answered the call of duty. Now the administration and Congress must do the same. Let's look at leadership in the budget. As elected officials, members of Congress have a responsibility to ensure that U.S. taxpayer dollars are not wasted on inefficient or redundant programs. I agree with Secretary Gates that we must scrutinize defense programs to ensure we're generating the most bang for the buck, and that we must concentrate our limited resources on the highest priority programs. Furthermore, I view it as a responsibility of the Armed Services Committee through our annual defense law to shift funds to higher national security priorities and promising techniques for the future, such as missile defense and the means to counter anti-access threats. Let's remember one of the core responsibilities of the Congress, as found in the Constitution, is to provide for the common defense, to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a Navy. I'm extremely concerned that no matter what the intentions of Secretary Gates may be, the administration and some in Congress will not allow the Secretary to keep the savings identified in his inefficiencies initiative. Just this summer, the White House supported a teacher bailout bill, a domestic spending measure that was funded in part with defense dollars. Secretary Gates can only do so much from the Pentagon. Sustaining growth for the Department of Defense requires leadership from the White House and the Office of Management and Budget. Once savings from this efficiencies initiative are identified, what's to stop them from taking this money also? Secretary Gates appears to share my concern. In August, he stated, "My greatest fear is that in economic tough times, the people will see the defense budget as the place to solve the nation's deficit problems. To find money for other parts of the government, I think that would be disastrous in the world environment we see today and what we're likely to see in the years to come." I share the Secretary's view that the growth in the department's top line is insufficient to address the future capabilities required by our military. 1% real growth in the defense budget over the next 5 years is a net cut for investment and procurement accounts. A defense budget in decline portends an America in decline. It will undermine our ability to project power, empower our adversaries, and weaken our alliances. This is a bipartisan view, not just one Republican's opinion. The Independent Bipartisan Quadrennial Defense Review, QDR panel, appointed by Congress, recognizes this fact. The co-chairman of that independent panel, Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, and Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor under George W. Bush, were clear on this point. The report states that our nation cannot afford business as usual and warns of a potential train wreck coming in the areas of personnel, acquisition, and force structure. Significantly, the report offers a realistic view of the global security environment, that maintaining and growing our alliances will place an increased demand on American hard power and require an increase in our military's force structure. Let me put this in the simplest terms possible. Cutting defense spending amidst 2 wars is a red line for me and should be a red line for all Americans. You do not need to be a policy expert to realize that investment is a key to maintaining a robust defense. Gallup recently said Americans are more likely now to say the United States national defense is not strong enough. The Hill's 2010 midterm election poll clearly states 6 in 10 Republicans and 53% of independents said they would not accept cuts to defense and homeland security spending. And I note that this was a poll that was conducted in battleground districts. In this case, like in many others, Congress would be well advised to listen to the wisdom of the American people. Advocates for reducing the size of the military view the global security environment through the lens of what they hope it to be and fail to see how it really is. As the recent air cargo plot and the Christmas Day terrorist attack reminded us, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates continue to threaten the homeland. Arguably, the greatest example of failed leadership in national security is the President's mishandling of the war on terror and the Guantanamo detainees. The Nigerian who attacked a U.S. airliner on Christmas Day trained in Yemen in an organization known as Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP. One of the spiritual leaders of AQAP, we know now, is an American-born cleric who radicalized Major Hassan, the U.S. Army psychiatrist who killed 13 at Fort Hood. Now this organization, with ties to the Fort Hood massacre, which planned and organized the Christmas Day attack and the recent air cargo plot, has in its leadership a former Guantanamo detainee. You would think this would make the president reevaluate his Guantanamo policy, that the president would see the perils of closing Guantanamo and the risk of returning detainees to countries already riddled with ungoverned spaces and al-Qaeda cells. The simple truth is that relaxing our Guantanamo policy puts Americans at risk. I believe America is the target of militant radicalism, not its source. I believe America is a force for peace in the world, not a cause for strife. And I believe we have a responsibility to defeat our enemies wherever they are, not treat and release them as if they were run-of-the-mill domestic criminals. My position is simple. No more Mirandizing terrorists. No more trials in downtown Manhattan. No more terrorist transfers to Yemen. The American people need a new terrorist detainee policy. Protecting the homeland and fighting radicalism abroad is only part of the challenge we face today. Other adversaries and enemies seek to do us harm too. Whether dealing with a former adversary like Russia, a competitor like China, or a present-day adversary like Iran or North Korea, I'm concerned that the president's emphasis on engagement has translated into weakness. It is putting our national security at risk. In fact, in a recent conversation with a combatant commander, he shared with me that he constantly fights the perception that the United States is in decline. What is driving this perception? Certainly, the administration's diplomacy contributes to the problem. But a deeper question lingers. Will America abandon a leadership role in support of its national interests? As the bipartisan Quadrennial Defense Review panel independent panel concluded, to do so will simply lead to an increasingly unstable and unfriendly global climate, and eventually to conflicts America cannot ignore, which we must then prosecute with limited choices under unfavorable circumstances, and with stakes that are higher than anyone would like. At stake is U.S. global leadership. If the administration fails to modernize and grow our military force structure, views of America in decline will harden and cause allegiances to shift. Those who think that if the U.S. does less globally, others will step up are correct. Others will fill the vacuum, but it won't be our allies. The UK, with its cut to defense, won't assure the freedom of the global commons. Rather, competitors like China will fill the void, and adversaries like Iran and North Korea will become more hostile. While China today may not intend to attack our carriers, neutralize our bases in Japan and Guam, or push back our naval presence out of the South China Sea, they are without question making the investments and developing capabilities to do just that. The question is whether we will be ready and capable to respond. The answer is unclear. To protect the homeland, our forward deployed forces deter and defend against Iran. Protect Israel and other allies. We can't just talk about missile defense. We need to invest in missile defense. This means more Aegis ships, more proven technologies, and maintaining the interceptors in the United States. Our adversaries and allies are watching. They know how to distinguish between rhetoric and action. When U.S. leadership is in question by allies or adversaries, global stability is at risk. A year ago, my critiques of administration policy hit on similar themes. but our capacity to respond to these policies now is entirely different. So for the remainder of my remarks, I'd like to share my plans for how I will lead the Armed Services Committee in the coming Congress if selected by my peers. Always got to put that little caveat in there. The House Armed Services Committee stands apart from the rest of the authorizing committees of the House for a number of reasons. Chief among them is its commitment to bipartisanship. This will continue. This is bipartisanship not simply in word, but in deed. The House has largely resisted the heated partisanship that pervades the Capitol because all members understand the solemn duty of serving on the committee. We serve to support and care for the men and women in uniform. Where there is disagreement that divides along party lines, the committee will continue the practice of debating an issue on the merits. In fact, this is precisely the type of committee oversight that John Boehner believes the whole House should adopt. Consistent with Leader Boehner's vision, all legislation in the Armed Services Committee will be prepared to hit the floor and be subject to an open rule. We are one of the few, if not the only committee, where every amendment offered by every member will enjoy a full debate with an up or down vote. Debate in our committee will be rooted in policy, not politics. The merit of one's amendment will be determined in the legislative process. This is a legacy to be proud of and one that will continue. Unfortunately, over the past couple of years, the Democratic leadership has departed from tradition. They've used the defense bill to advance a controversial agenda on the backs of our military men and women. Whether it be the hate crimes legislation, immigration, or don't ask, don't tell, the defense bill has been used as a vehicle to divide instead of unite the Congress. This must end today. The National Defense Authorization Act, especially in wartime, should be focused on one core reality: caring and providing for the men and women in uniform and their families. In carrying out our constitutional mandate, we will place renewed emphasis on oversight and investigations. Our investigations will be relevant to the warfighter and the protection of our homeland, while protecting the integrity of the military and its personnel. We're not interested in gotcha oversight. We'll be doing true oversight to make sure our military is stronger. First, our focus will be on winning the wars in Afghanistan, not solely on ending the conflict. What does this mean? We will ensure the warfighter is getting what they need to accomplish their mission. For example, if the arbitrary troop cap set by the President is impacting force protection and other enablers, our committee will work vigorously to expose the problem and see that it's addressed. If our commanders in Afghanistan send Washington a joint urgent operational needs statement and it languishes in the Pentagon bureaucracy, we will expedite the process. Most importantly, we will challenge any attempt to deny our forces enablers and force protection because of an arbitrary, politically imposed troop cap. We will also focus on detainee policy. The days of U.S. courts making policy through case law must come to an end. Armed Services Committee members will work to craft a legislative framework for terrorist detention that protects the homeland, respects the rule of law, and upholds our high ideals. We need to keep terrorists off our soil, not invite them here and then pay for their legal representation. We need to reaffirm in statute the authorization to use military force of 2001. Our forces in Afghanistan and around the world do not doubt that we continue to be at war with Al-Qaeda and its affiliated networks. They put their lives at risk every day. Therefore, Congress should ensure no court in the land questions the legal authority for our forces to prosecute this war. Make no mistake, the Armed Services Committee will conduct thorough oversight of this administration's detainee policies and work to legislate a framework that is guided by the law of armed conflict, not the criminal justice system. A broader challenge for our oversight is the administration's lack of transparency. The Department of Defense, led by Secretary Gates, is guilty of this as well. Whether it is stiff-arming the committee on document requests related to the closure of the Joint Forces Command, to mandatory gag orders being imposed on the military, or willful noncompliance on statutorily mandated reports, this committee will assert its oversight prerogative. Let me conclude by stepping back from Capitol Hill and take a moment to explain why, in the midst of the significant national security challenges I've discussed this afternoon, we all have reason to be optimistic. My optimism is rooted in the spirit and courage of the men and women, military and civilian alike, who serve to defend our country and provide for its security. You know, I've been around a while. I understand what it means to call a generation the greatest generation. This is not because I read a book about the greatest generation, but because I knew the men and women of that generation. I remember seeing them leave their families to fight for our freedom and liberate the oppressed. And I saw those men return home. One of those men was my dad. He'd been gone over a year in the Philippines. Actually, he was married, had 2 sons, so he was drafted late in the conflict and was actually sent over to the Philippines after the war was over. But I remember watching when he started to climb off that plane and my mom started climbing the chain link fence between us and the plane. It was a real experience. And then I remember seeing my dad visit with some of his friends. His best friend, David Ward, had been killed crossing a bridge in Germany. And my next brother was named after him. Ralph Whitley, good friend of my dad's. My dad was in the meat business. Ralph was also in the business. And I remember going over to their home sometimes, seeing my dad talk to Ralph, who was a fighter pilot in the Pacific. And my dad's best friend when he was growing up, Glenn Hendricks, was a bomber pilot in the European theater. When they would get together, they didn't so much dwell on the war that they had all participated in, but they talked about their businesses, about their families, about times they had growing up, and about what the future would bring for them. The generation that defeated fascism and imperialism and restored liberty in Europe and Asia returned home after the war and had the vision, grit, and fortitude to fight communism and ultimately prevail in the Cold War. They ushered America into an era of prosperity and showed the world that our country, our system of government, our freedoms, and our compassion were unmatched and unparalleled. The greatest generation made America great. I saw it when I was a kid at the end of World War II, and I see it again today. Our veterans who fought on the battlefields of Baghdad and Fallujah, and the young volunteers who are fighting today on the battlefields of Helmand and Kandahar are the next great generation. Their stories of courage and sacrifice in the service of freedom and liberty have yet to be fully chronicled. But I'm certain that history will rank their service the best this nation has ever seen. Their story is not complete. Their service in Iraq and Afghanistan is only the first chapter. The civil affairs officer who served in northern Iraq, the logistician who operated out of Balad Air Base, or the provincial reconstruction team member who's bringing stability to eastern Afghanistan will return home and lead our country. Some will govern at the state level. More will be the innovators and entrepreneurs that will restore our economy to greatness. and still others will serve with me in the 112th Congress, as they are now currently serving in the 111th Congress. All are patriots who will know what it means to sacrifice for freedom. Our nation will look to them just as it did to the veterans of another war over 60 years ago, just as it did to Washington and the leaders of the great fight for the liberation of this country. The next chapter in the chronicles of this generation is about to be written. We've only begun to see their accomplishments. I'm optimistic that our nation will benefit from the results. The fruits of their labor will be nothing less than another era of American prosperity. For this, there is reason for optimism. Thank you, and God bless.
That was terrific. That was great. I'd like to just start our discussion with a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Basically, I have three questions for you, Mr. McKeon, on bipartisanship, budget cutting, budgets, and oversight. On the bipartisanship, I think you rightly referred to the tradition of the committee as being a bipartisan tradition, and I applaud your desire to maintain that tradition and repair to it. My question is, given the fact that we've just come out of an election cycle which I think people feel has been extraordinarily partisan, very harsh in terms of the campaign, given the fact that during the course of that campaign, your partner, the outgoing chairman, who would have been ranking member under your chairmanship, Ike Skelton, has lost his seat and will not be returning to the Congress. And we don't even know at this point who the ranking Democrat will be. Mr. Ortiz is locked in a recount in Texas. I think he's trailing by a couple of hundred votes right now. Whether it be Mr. Reyes, Ms. Sanchez, Mr. Ortiz, we still don't know. So I guess I have two questions on that score. One, is there any utility in, first of all, recognizing Mr. Skelton's great service to the nation and to the committee in some way to try and, as a gesture of respect for the bipartisan approach that he took, both as chairman and as a member of the committee? And do you feel you're going to have the ability to work together with the other members of the committee, given the big change that's taken place in the composition of the committee?
You're right. This was a very tough election, and I mean, I was out in many districts campaigning, and I saw a lot of the ads that were run on television, and it was pretty sickening. But now we're past that, and my hope is that we can do something. I'm hopeful of doing something for Ike. He's put over 30 years of his life here, dedicated to the men and women of the armed services on this committee. And I was hopeful that we could probably finish up the bill. I haven't talked to anybody about this and name it after him. But now, again, it's caught up in some things that are making it very difficult to get the bill passed. But I will be looking for something that we could do for Ike. I really enjoyed the time working with him as the ranking member. He's just a solid, great individual, and everybody liked Ike. So we'll look to that. Now, whoever the new ranking member is, I'm sure will be able to work well. I think it's the majority's responsibility to create bipartisanship. The minority can't really force their way into a meeting. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, we were shut out of a lot of things. But again, I think when we were in the majority before, the way I operated as a subcommittee chairman and for a short time as full committee chairman is let's work together. And we did that, and we'll continue to do that. In fact, whoever the ranking member is, I'm I have an idea that we take a Codell to their district and visit the bases in their district, and then some others around the country. It'll give us a chance to bring some of the members on the committee together, plus to show people that we are going to be working in a bipartisan manner. So I'm very confident that we'll be able to do that.
Great, that's terrific. On the budget, you said cutting the budget, the defense budget, when the country's in two wars was a red line for you, I think you said in your remarks. We've had a couple of different reports now, and yet another has made its way into the press, which is the Budget Reduction, Deficit Reduction Commission. The Ron Paul, Barney Frank Sustainable Development Commission issued a report a while back, and it made clear that the budget cuts it was proposing in defense were predicated on the notion of somehow shrinking America's ambitions in the world, America's role in the world. The QDR panel that the Congress created looked at the problem from different optic, which was if the United States, and it was made up mostly of people who'd actually served in government at fairly high levels on both sides of the partisan divide, it concluded that if the United States is going to continue operating in the world as it has in the past, and the previous panel was talking a little bit about South China Sea and Indian Ocean, et cetera, that the United States was not going to be able to dramatically downsize the budget, and the QDR panel actually suggested Secretary Gates, in calling for 2.5% to 3% real growth over the course of the fight, actually might have been underestimating what's needed. We now have the Deficit Reduction Commission, which is proposing a $100 billion cut in the next fiscal year off the top line. Have you had a chance to look at their recommendations?